Hi everyone. Today we'll be talking about Gregor Mendel, who is often called the father of genetics for his pioneering work on inheritance using pea plants. Even though his work was not recognized for its value during his lifetime, it was only years after his death that it was rediscovered, and biologists realized that he had worked out many of the original principles of genetics. So first, I'd like to point your attention to a very helpful video on Mendel and what he did with his peas. It's a TED Talk, so one address is here. If you want a shorter, easier to remember address, you can go to tinyurl.com/TED Talk Mendel, and that video is very helpful, so I would recommend it. Alright, so Mendel lived in the 1800s. He was an Austrian monk. Where he was born is today part of the Czech Republic, but there was no Czech Republic then, just the Empire of Austria. He studied science and math, and he was most well known for his work with peas, but he did do other things. Obviously, he was a monk. Scientist often wasn't a real career path in the 1800s. So often those interested in science had another job and did science more as a hobby. Uh, Mendel was interested in genetics, as we'll find out, but he also was very interested in meteorology and did many other experiments. But we're going to focus on his genetics work. So what did Mendel do? Why was his work so important? He looked at the inheritance using pea plants. He focused on seven characteristics of peas, like features like flower color, seed shape, and a couple terms useful to know here. When we say characteristic, we mean a heritable feature, something that can be passed down. And traits we usually mean as a variant of a characteristic, like this could be flower color, and the trait is yellow flowers or white flowers or what have you. Alright, so how did he do this? First, he had to control which plants were breeding, and these peas, like a lot of plants, release pollen into the wind, or they have pollinators that brush against them and get pollen and then transport it to another plant. So you often do not know who the two parents are when a plant makes seeds. So Mendel had to control that because he had to know who the parents were. So he could do he could have the plant self-pollinate by taking pollen from the anthers and putting it directly on the stigma. He could also cross by taking pollen from one plant, putting it on the stigma of another plant, and then he could remove the anthers to make sure there was no accidental self-pollination if he wanted cross-pollination. So he controlled this carefully so he knew who the parents were of each offspring. Alright, so we're going to focus first on flower color here. So in these peas, there tend to be two colors of flowers, purple and white. So first thing he did is he grew true breeding plants. What that means is if you crossed, he had purple plants that when you bred them produce all purple offspring. And he'd do the same thing and get white, and they produced all white offspring. So those are what we call true breeding. All right, and then we use this notation here. The P generation is the parental generation. F1 generation is the first offspring. F stands for filial, which means offspring. And then the F2 generation is the offspring of the F1 generation. So he crossed these true breeding plants, all right, and then he recorded the number and type of offspring, their color. What he found was, in this example, when he crossed the purple and white true breeding plants, all of the offspring had purple flowers. The prevailing theory at the time about genetics was blending theory, that offspring got a blend of their parents' traits, and that is what produced new traits in the offspring. However, he saw when he crossed purple flowers with white that he got all purple offspring. Then, when he allowed these plants to breed with each other, he found something interesting. He found a 3-to-1 ratio. 3 out of 4 offspring would be purple, but 1 out of 4 would be white, even though none of the parents were white. But the grandparent had been white, so this was very confusing, and he started thinking, how can this happen? So if we look more at his data, okay, we have the 7 traits he looked at here. Right, so if we're looking, we got flower color, flower position, seed color, seed shape, pod color, and stem length. Now, Mendel did get lucky in his choice of peas here, because peas do have relatively simple genetics for a lot of traits. Now, if we go over here and actually look at his data, so Mendel did a lot of growing peas. You are going to see the F2 generation. Right. So again, that's the grand children of the first generation. Here he had 705 purple offspring and 224 white offspring, which gives a 3.15 to 1 ratio. And then you go down here, 651 of the axial position and 207 of the terminal position. Seeds, 6,022 yellow, 2,001 green, and so on. And what you should notice, looking at these ratios, 3.15 to 1, 3.14 to 1, 3.01 to 1, 2.96 to 1, they're almost all very, very close to 3 to 1, right? And what this gave him the idea of is that one trait was masking the other, and then it reappeared in the next generation. So Mendel called these genetic controls factors. Now we use the term alleles. And there are dominant and recessive alleles. Dominant alleles can cover up the recessive allele. So this made sense in terms of Mendel's results. Going back and looking at these results one more time. If you had the offspring of the true breeding plants be heterozygous, and then you cross them, you'd expect a 3-to-1 ratio of the dominant to recessive in the offspring. Of course, no one knew this at the time. This is how Mendel worked it out. Now, there is some debate about Mendel's results, because some of these numbers are incredibly close to 3-to-1, far more close than you are likely to get. So there is debate among scientists about whether Mendel might have accidentally doctored his results or changed them once he knew what he expected. That is difficult to say. We don't really have a reason to think that Mendel was dishonest, but there is some disagreement there. But whether or not he did that, he did work out a lot of these pioneering genetic principles. And then later we came up with the nomenclature of using the capital letter to refer to the dominant allele, like big P for purple flower color, and using the lowercase letter little p to refer to the recessive allele, which would be white flower color. Alright, so that was a brief intro on Mendel and how he worked out some of the laws of genetics using peas.